Gonna resume the recording. Welcome, everybody, near and far. Oh, it is fun to also know where folks are coming from. If you want to put in the chat your city or state, that'd be fun. I am coming from Seattle, Washington. We have Philly, Milwaukee, of course, New York, Brooklyn, Cincinnati, the one in Ohio. Okay, California, Northern Cali, Southern Cali, Portland. How fantastic. Dallas. Oh, this is so much fun. Okay, so an overview. The Adoptee Mentoring Society, I founded about 4 years ago, and we've been growing. I'm so grateful to so many of our donors and supporters. Amanda is here. Amanda is our COO, has been involved volunteering before coming aboard, and our other staff, Juliet, wasn't able to be here today, but it's a small team of three of us, all working part-time and always looking for others who might want to support and help us spread the word about AMS. Um, Tonight, we are featuring Luna, Ricky, and Adam, three mentees. So the Fireside Chat is an opportunity for those who've been mentored by AMS to speak publicly. It's really the only public offering that AMS has because everything else is adoptee centered, so sacred to us. But for tonight, I'm so excited for Luna, Ricky, and Adam to share about discoveries that they've had while participating in the adoptee lounges. Um, so hopefully that's where you were meaning to be as you signed on to this event. And I think I can get us going. Oh, one last thing. One thing that's huge for me as the founder of AMS is that the organization participates in ethical storytelling. So essentially, that's kind of a 180 degree from what so many adoptees are used to, where people ask us about our lives and our stories, and there's kind of a unspoken mandate that we respond and share all of our life stories to sometimes total strangers. And that is just not what I love. So for here, in many of the mentoring sessions, we talk about like, let's think about what things we really want to share with the world, what things might be really private to us, and that we have a prep meeting with myself and this panelist and Amanda to make sure that we are thinking through what we are sharing and why. So that is one really important concept to me. So when we get to the Q&A section, it's okay to ask whatever questions you have and know that our panelists are fully empowered to say, that's not something I want to answer. Um, and that is a beautiful thing. So ethical story sharing is really key for us. Okay, so Amanda, are folks pinned? Want
Not
to make sure,
yet. I can do that right now.
just so that everyone can see our speakers. Adam, there you are. Ricky, there you are. And Luna, perfect. So let's get started with just some high-level bios. I would love for each of you to share um, just a general overview of who you are. And it'd be great if you added a fun detail. So it's a little bit about your adoption and maybe where you were born and grew up, but then also something unexpected that we might not know. Ricky, do you want to start us off?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Alrighty, so my name is Ricky Ferrari Trainer. I sorry, what questions did you want me to answer exactly again?
Bio, like where do you live?
Bio.
When
Okay.
were you adopted? And a fun fact.
All right. So I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, born and raised. I was adopted by my original foster family. I was forcibly removed from my biological mother's custody when I was 16 months old, and then adopted by my foster parents when I was 5 years old. I am a transracial adoptee, which means that my adoptive parents were of a different race than mine. They were white or are. They're still alive. They're white. And so I was raised in a predominantly white community. And one interesting thing about me is I was a paid child actor here in Milwaukee. Yeah, and I was a big theater kid up until around freshman year of college.
I love it. Thank you. Did you share a little bit about your current work?
No, so currently, I am the manager of the Prevention and Early Intervention section with the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. And in that section is our sexual assault and domestic violence prevention program, as well as our evidence-based home visitation program that works in early childhood intervention.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Ricky. So glad you're here. Adam, high level overview. Who are you?
Hi, well, thanks for having me. My name is Adam. I'm a transnational adoptee born in Jalisco, Mexico. I have one older brother who is also adopted from Mexico, a different biological family. My parents couldn't have children naturally, so they went through an independent lawyer, not an agency, and picked us up from Mexico. A funny fact, when I was younger, I did some modeling and acting. A couple of book covers, one for a Nancy Drew book titled The Case of the Creative Crime. And what's so funny is that this is about 20 years later. They've yet to change the book cover, and it's still out there
Wow.
um, on Amazon. Yeah, I did a couple of other things. A Whitney Houston music video where she didn't show up the first day of shooting. So as an apology or a thank you, I guess, she's saying the verse and the chorus of "I Will Always Love You" to us, to the principal cast, which was really cool because her voice was, just as you heard it on the radio, so talented. I'm no Whitney Houston, but I myself have put a few songs out there that are still floating around on iTunes and Amazon, and had one on a Netflix series many, many moons ago.
Wow, Ricky. Wow. Okay. Thank you for all of those. I love all those details. One reason that I ask for non-adoption related details is because it is a big piece of our work at the Adoptee Mentoring Society is to amplify other identities and aspects that make us who we are, not just being an adoptee. Luna, round us out.
All right. Okay, so I'm 17, so I'm always the youngest person in these rooms, but it's okay. And I'm a transracial adoptee. So both my parents are white, and I was placed with them at 6 months old. So basically, I didn't spend that much time in the foster care system. I spent 3 days with other people, and then the rest of my life has been with my parents. So yeah. And then I have a younger sister who's a year and a half younger than me, and she's my half sister, and she's adopted with me. And then I also have a little brother who's adopted, but he is I don't know if you've heard this term, but a snowflake baby, which means he's like adopted as an embryo because my parents can have kids, but my mom, I guess, wanted to have a natural birth. So yeah. And then I went to private Christian school for most of my life until this year. So that's a fun fact to get about me, I guess. And I also have played soccer since I was 4, so 13 years. And yeah, I don't have quite as much life experience as Ricky and Adam, so there's a little bit less to say. Oh, I do DECA and FBLA, which are both business competitions. DECA State is tomorrow, so that's exciting for me. And I just found out I made it to FBLA State, so
Wow,
it's my
Luna.
first year doing that. So yeah, it's fun.
Oh,
It's like competing in marketing pitches. Yeah,
wow, that's great.
Really
Thank
cool.
you.
yeah.
I'm going to ask our guests three more questions, three or four, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody to ask questions. But you're welcome to put things in the chat now, and we'll get to them at the end if you'd like. So, my next question for each all of you is why did you want to speak publicly in this fireside chat? And if you could also add, if this is your first time speaking publicly and maybe a little feelings, how do you feel right now doing this? Let's do the same order of Ricky, Adam, Luna.
All right. So, I have to say that I feel nervous, but also really excited. I am professional speaker. I do speak in front of large groups about various topics related to like trauma-informed care, parenting styles, stuff like that. But this is very personal, so like putting all of Ricky out there for the world is a very vulnerable thing for me to do, but I'm really excited that AMS offers us adoptees the opportunity to do that. And so my wife, who's here, Leah, she actually bought me this book for my birthday last year, The Big 4-0. And so we read part of it together, and I finished it very quickly. And everything that was in your book, You Should Be Grateful, Angela, was resonated with me. And I was like, wow, so somebody else has that experience, right? And that feeling of kinship and that feeling of belonging was still is a very important part of who I am now as both a leader and as a man, just to hold on to that feeling. And so why I wanted to come and speak at this fireside chat is to hopefully offer that opportunity to feel seen and heard by somebody else that's gone through, that is an adoptee, that is a transracial adoptee, and has thrived.
Thank you, Ricky. Appreciate your honesty. Um, Adam, same question about why did you want to speak and how are you feeling about being here?
Sure. Well, I work in community outreach in Queens, New York. So it's a very diverse population, but I enjoy connecting with people through my work. And I agree with Ricky in that these are personal topics, and I surprisingly feel more comfortable after doing the dress rehearsal that we had did to kind of go over everything. And about almost 2 years ago, biological family had contacted me via 23andMe. And since then, through sharing a large part via AMS, it's been cathartic. And I've been able to speak more freely and more comfortably about these topics, and it's super healthy. And I love hearing situations that other adoptees have gone through that I could relate to, and vice versa. So, I'm kind of using it as continued catharsis and just to kind of give insight, if it resonates with anybody.
Okay, so this is my third adoptee lounge, I believe. Or not adoptee lounge, whoa. Fireside chat.
Yeah.
So I'm not really nervous, but I like doing these because I like sharing an experience from someone who's younger. I feel like I give a unique voice because a lot of your younger mentees they don't speak out. And also I've been um, in adoptee lounge since I was 12, and that's 5 years ago. So um, I've had a lot of experience, and I've known Angela for quite some time. So I like doing it because I feel like these topics I've talked a lot about, and I feel comfortable in my ability to speak about it in front of people who aren't adopted and who um, like are as familiar with the experience, and I feel like I can articulate it well.
Mhm. So, kind of my first question for the three of you, and you can ping off each other. You can go in any order you'd like, but I'm curious what life was like prior to finding adoptee-centric spaces like the Adoptee Lounge or one-on-one mentorship. Were you connected to other adoptees? Did you talk about adoption freely, openly, with confidence? What did it look like?
Well, in high school, I remember there were two other students in my class who were adopted, and we actually clung to each other. It was short-lived. It was towards the end of high school, and then after that, it was very few and far between where I would meet an adoptee. But it was always, which I think a lot of adoptees can agree with, it was always an instant understanding and a connection, like, oh, I understand. But it wasn't enough, so I still felt isolated and alone in the problems and issues that I was dealing with. So it was harder to address those until I found adoptee-centric forums like AMS, and that completely opened up many new doors.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Adam. I remember feeling the same way for a long time about my adoptee identity. I never really gave it much thought. I did know that I was a transracial adoptee, so I was raised in a white community. And so that kind of put me in between two cultures, really, because I wasn't white enough for white culture or black enough for black culture. And when I connected with my biological family, that disconnect with my black identity was very, they made it very, very known to me. And so as an adoptee, my adoptee identity just seemed like more of a burden, right? Like I couldn't fit with one culture or another. I was kind of caught in between in this shade of gray. But it wasn't until I got much older and until I honestly, until I read Angela's book that I realized that there's this overarching identity that I had as an adoptee that many adoptees have gone through. And honestly, we never talked about it. I was raised in a large adoptive family, so I had many siblings to engage with who some were adopted, some were foster, and some were biological to my adoptive parents. So I never really ha had to seek out community before because I always had a large support group and many siblings and now many nieces and nephews. And so my life was pretty full in that regard. So to find that community here was intentionally, was very meaningful.
You know what it's like? It really is prior to finding AMS, it was dealing with something that you feel is profoundly unrelatable. And you speak to all of these other adoptees and you realize that it is relatable and it makes you feel less alone. I know, at least when I was growing up, I was very sharply aware that I was different. When I did things like looking in the mirror, even, I always knew something was different about me, but I just didn't really have the language to express it, especially as a child. And even growing up into my teens, the one of the major things was not looking like anybody in my immediate family. I remember in school we would do all these projects. One specifically sticks out in my mind, and we were to bring a photo of our family in and kind of tell the class who we looked like and who we didn't look like. And I never brought a photo in, but I would just kind of make up a story.
Mm.
And pretend. Inside it made me really upset. When I was connected with my biological family and I saw a picture of my brother. I have a biological brother who we share the same father and mother. And I remember looking at his photo and seeing my face. And I have to say it was probably one of the most profound moments of my life to see my face on somebody else. If that could kind of explain how powerful that moment was and how I missed out on it growing up. So to know that other people have felt that too, being within the community, has softened that blow that I felt all those years.
Um,
And go ahead, Luna. Yeah, talking
Thank-
about
okay. I was just gonna add on to that. Um wait, okay, that's something I was gonna say. But oh yeah, I am like my biological mother had 5 girls and they all have different dads. So she is a mix of white and Asian. So she's Vietnamese. So my entire side of the family that I know, they're all Asian, and I'm more mixed than that. So I have like all of that mixture, and then plus like African American, but like watered down through years of like being in America, if that makes sense. So like just like super mixed. So I knew like forever that everybody in my life, like whether be it adopted family or biological family, that no one in like the world really like looks like me specifically because I'm so mixed. So like when people would be like, "Oh, who's your like celebrity lookalike?" I've never had one. So anyway, that's a little tangent. But my half sister that lives with me, we look completely different. Like to the point where people don't even realize we're sisters. So growing up, I just kind of always knew like it was almost normal in my head though that like it's all like this. And we had like family friends and there's actually quite a few people at this private Christian school that were adopted, ironically enough, which there was like 30 people in my grade and at least 5 of them were adopted. So anyway, so I was around it a lot. Um, and I always just assumed like this is my life, this is normal. And I remember like realizing it was less normal when my little brother is Mexican and Italian, but he has dark hair like my adopted father. So people will be like, "Oh, like that's his son." They'll like be able to like pick it out and be like, "Oh, I see the resemblance." So one time my grandfather was picking this up from like after school care or whatever, and this lady told my like grandfather that he had such resemblance to my brother, and I looked at her and I was like, he's adopted. And she was like, oh, sorry, but um I was told that that was like rude of me to say. And I always think that's interesting because I don't think people always assume like when you see people like that they're biologically related in families, but I knew a lot of families that had adopted children where a lot of people didn't realize it
Mhm.
versus my experience like looking at that and always being like knowing that at the second people saw me with my parents they would know I was not like theirs in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of I'm hearing a theme of without being in adoptee centric spaces, a lot of the adoption talk, if it happened, was kind of negative. Like Luna said the words like, "Oh, I'm sorry." That someone said, "I'm sorry," thinking that this was a biological child. It wasn't. Um, Adam gave your examples about the school assignments and never seeing a photo or for the first time seeing a photo that kind of resembled yourself. And Ricky, I know in our dress rehearsal you talked about um, the tokenism that came that you assumed was kind of just normal or maybe made you feel special. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I was gonna mention it. Thank you for bringing it up, Luna. That like I didn't realize that I was so different than my environment. Um, I just knew that every February I would get in front of our congregation because I was raised in Catholic education. I would get in front of our congregation and read like a Langston Hughes poem, or I'd sit at the front of the class while we listened to Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And I remember vividly sitting on a float with a white sheet across me and broomstick and press-on gold earrings to represent Africa. And these things like happened to me, and I was like excited to do them, right? And in hindsight, I see now they were just plain old tokenism, and my community did that to me. And I didn't really know until later on that that was tokenism. That was me being like a caricature instead of a human being. And when I realized that's what was going on, I felt ashamed of myself that I felt so enthusiastic, but I was just engaging with my community. I didn't know that I was really being treated like an it until much later, right? And that made me like as a younger man, like really angry, but also feeling really lost and sad, because I didn't have a place like anywhere to take that because my siblings didn't have the same experience, my biological family didn't have that experience, and so I was just here alone having that experience. But Luna, hearing about your experience and hearing Adam about your experiences, it sounds like adoptees have gone through this, even if you're not a transracial adoptee, you've gone through this in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, the language piece seems interesting here that I know for Ricky, you just learned the word transracial when you read my book, which is fascinating knowing you grew up with so many other adoptees in your family. And I think just adding on to this main question about life pre-adoptee centric spaces, um, were there therapists or other folks who you could speak with about adoption? Um, and then on top of that, I think Luna, I'm not sure if you've really lived in a world where you haven't had adoptee centered spaces because generationally, I think there's a lot of difference with um, her parents really understanding the importance of her being in those places, whereas Ricky and Adam, perhaps you didn't. Does anyone want to speak to that?
Well, being an adoptee wasn't something that we talked about, right? It was obvious because I am much darker than my adoptive parents. But we didn't talk about it, and if we talked about it, it was kind of like this like dark history,
Mm,
right? Um, and so like none of my siblings have sought their biological family if they didn't already have a connection. Um, and we never really talked about it. The only time I ever even talked about Black culture was during Black History Month. And that was really to talk about the civil rights movement with no acknowledgement of a much deeper
wow.
history. And it wasn't just the civil rights movement and slavery that embodied Black culture in America. But yeah, we never talked about it, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I really started to realize that that is an important part of my identity. And then read your book, and that gave me language
Wow.
to identify with.
When I was younger, I was much more Latino looking. My skin tone was more olive. You could tell by looking at a photo, oh, he must be Mexican or something along those lines. We didn't discuss it um, to a major extent in at home, although my parents provided children's books and that was great. I remember some of my happiest moments though were going to the Museum of Art in the city with my grandma Selma, and she would take me to the part of the Mexican exhibits, and I was maybe 6 years old. But there was always this one exhibit that I gravitate towards. I gravitated towards. It was called the Mexican Smiling Man. And it's still there to this day. And in me, it was a little piece of me reaching out to that Mexican part that was never really given that attention growing up. But when I went to the museum, those times, it brought it all back, and in a way that I wished there was more of that growing up. Um, as far as support, I had tried in my teenage years to go to groups. There was a group at a local church, I remember. The thing was, though, is that it was predominantly made up of adoptive parents. So when I was speaking in this group, it was really clear to me that they weren't seeing things eye to eye. I don't even know if they were receiving the information. So it was really discouraging to me at that time. You know, things are different now. Fortunately, we have all these great things like AMS, but back then it was rough. I ended up leaving that group, and I didn't go back.
Hmm.
Well, for me, of course, it's a little different because I've like I started going to these lounges when I was 12. So my life before that was very like I was still a child. So I wasn't thinking about these things in too much detail versus if I was like a teenager. I also want to say I'm like a lot darker than like the camera showing me in person. This is my dad's setup, so it washes me out so bad. But yeah, I guess out of my two siblings, out of the three of us, I have the darkest skin. So sometimes I would think to myself, I would look at them and I would be like, you could believe they were like a family if I wasn't here, or and stuff like that. So more not like external things that I'd say out loud, but just things I'd think. And I think that being in an adoptee lounge is something like reset, like not reset my brain, reword and reconstruct the way I thought about adoption. And then also when I started doing these lounges, I had gotten into this weird phase of life where my parents weren't around me all the time anymore. And for my whole life up until that point, everyone knew I was adopted because I was around the same people since kindergarten and they had all seen my parents. And I had always said it as something that was just true. And when you know someone for like 8 years, they're going to know pretty much everything about you. And the things I did were like church and soccer. They saw my parents drop me off. And then I got into middle school and I was riding the bus to school and it was hundreds of new people. And I realized that's not something everyone like they can't look at you and be able to be like, oh, she's adopted. And like it would be crazy how long I go knowing people and then they'd eventually one day be like, wait, are you adopted? And I'd be like, oh yeah. But I think it's interesting because now when I talk to people about me being adopted, it's like I think before it might have been like a not insulting question, but like, oh, like we're talking about this again. But now I like really enjoy talking about it. Like this past weekend, I went to like a church camp, and one of the leaders was asking me about my experience with adoption because his only contact with it was his aunt and uncle had adopted a daughter, and she and them like do not get along at all, and like have she's had a really bad experience with the foster care system. And I got to kind of give him another perspective about my experience. So it's helped me be able to talk about stuff more. Which I know this question's about life before it, but I think just comparing and contrasting before and after is
Yeah,
more applicable to me.
sure. Thank
And
you.
sorry,
Go ahead.
and one
Go
thing
ahead.
about the lounges, is that it helped me like realize that um, being a transracial adoptee made the fact that I'm adoptee obvious, but I got to see what it was like to be when you're the same race as your adoptive parents and that struggle,
Yeah.
right? Because it may or may not be spoken about at all because you pass, right,
Right.
as a biological member of the family. And so that's one thing that was talked about in the lounges, and that's another great thing that the lounges offer.
That's so great. Okay, we're moving into the next question, which I love, which is, what discoveries have you made in the Adoptee Lounge? And for everybody who may not know, the Adoptee Lounge is our group mentoring space, virtual, but we have kind of by age group, maybe 5 to 8 adoptees who are in a group together, facilitated conversation. Um, what additional discoveries? I think, Ricky, your example is really great that we don't often think about same race adoptees and their experiences because the conspicuous nature of being such a different color than your adoptive parents really gets a lot of airtime, but to think about how many other adoptees have different experiences. Um, with this question about the discoveries that you've made in the Adoptee Lounge, I'm also curious if there was like apprehension to join, or how you decided that first time to come. Talk to us about that.
It was a slow process, I think, for me. I found out about AMS. I reached out, and it took me quite some time to do a session and then to become involved and speak more in the Slack community, the online community. And it was really like dipping your toe into the pool. But when, like I was saying before, I saw other adoptees and saw certain stories and the way that some adoptees were expressing themselves through things like frustration or speaking about abandonment issues or identity crisis. Those are all things that rang a very loud bell in me and made me more comfortable speaking to them. And
Do you wanna be more specific about that, Adam?
uh, as to a specific moment in Slack, I think I just noticed several different conversations of people expressing their situation and, let's say, how they had felt abandoned by either their birth mother or birth father. So that had prompted me to speak about how I felt, which that is how I felt. I mean, my whole life I had felt let go of. Although my parents that raised me are amazing people, I had a constant feeling of being pushed to the side.
I'm
And
curious about like if you can remember examples. I think in general, so many spaces we do use the word abandonment or loss, and I don't know if general folks have like a real good picture of what that means. So for you, Adam, I think there were times when you had shared with me the need for your parents to be really specific about, I'm going to leave for 10 minutes and then I'm going to come back, and how you realized, and please correct me, but how you realize like even little things like that would kind of activate that abandonment sense.
yes, when I was a child and I had first started going to school, my mother could not drop me off and just leave me at the school. This was not just in school, but at school it came out much more. I would cry bloody murder. You would think it was the end of the world. And I had recently had a conversation with my parents, well, last summer, and I brought this up because over the years we would bring it up, or my mother would bring it up as kind of a cute memory, of your son just loving his mom so much and never wanting her to go. But I had to articulate to her, I said, Mom, I was hysterical, not because I thought you were going to be late when you were picking me up from school, but because a large part of me as a child thought that you were not going to come back, like ever. And that was the true sentiment of what I was going through. And they didn't fully grasp that until I had explained it to them. Now they do. And I think that's something really important to know if you're a parent who's looking to adopt. Maybe when your child gets to that age, to have a quick talk with them when you drop them off to school and say, I'm definitely going to be back here and we're going to go home and do whatever it is that we do at home, but I'm going to be right here for you to pick you up and take you home. Just those things, which I guess, like Luna was saying before, not everything is always perceivable when you're looking at an adoptee. And like many people, you don't know what's going on inside of them. And in some situations, like with adoptees, you do have to try and peel the onion a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, Luna, you go.
there you go. Okay. I was just gonna say, I like agree with that sentiment of like, I always wanted to have control, and I have like very strong anxiety over just like, I want to know what's happening next. And I want to, every day, I ask my mom, what's for dinner? What's for dinner? And she, now that we're like in like depth, like looking into like have like me having anxiety, she's like, I think you've always had it, and that's why you ask so many questions. And when I was younger and it was just like me and her at the house and I'd be with her for so long, she had to limit the amount of questions I'd ask. She'd be like, okay, you have 3 questions, you have to choose what to use them on, because I'd always ask, what's this, what's that? And I just want to have this drive to know everything, and I like plans and like knowing what's on the calendar, which is really interesting because when it comes to myself, I'm not very organized in knowing what I'm having to do. But as soon as someone else is organizing it or doing something, I like to know everything they're doing. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
I
I think Luna, your parents have likely benefited from language from the adoption agency around trauma-informed parenting and trauma-informed care. And this is really not something that used to be talked about because adoption was not seen as a trauma.
Yeah, and before I was with my parents, they had quite a few kids that were with them, and a lot of them had significant like abuse done to them at a young age where they were like addicted to drugs as infants. And so my mom had spent countless like hours a week with kids just like calming them down. And so when it came to me, part of my thing was I was very independent at an age where children should not be as independent as I was. And so my mom would rock me to sleep every night and I'd sob. I'd be in hysterics because I would just want to be in the crib by myself. And so I think I have less trauma in a way because my mom like intervened and like lessened it and the impacts of the trauma. But yeah. And I also shoot. Oh, my mom told me recently that when she and my dad had decided to adopt me and my sister later, but she was terrified that someone was going to come to the door and say like, "Oh, you can't adopt him." Like she would have nightmares about people coming and saying that they were going to take us away because she was like at that point she was like all in on us. And I thought that was really interesting because um I hadn't like thought of it like being like a double trauma kind of like had my sister and I be taken away, like that would have been so hard for my mom too. So I think that
Mm.
um I don't know, it was just a little tangent, but
Yeah, but
there you
Luna,
go.
No,
this is a great example of what happens in lounges and these discussions. Because by you just saying that, I correlated my OCD as a child to my adoption just now because I did the same things. And my mother still says to this day, you just ask the same question over and over again, and you needed to know when exactly is this going to happen? What day? What time? It was a constant. So in
yeah.
that, there was just another discovery. Thank
It
you.
can make so much
Yeah.
sense in hindsight, and I know we often get responses when people watch these fireside chats and see folks like Luna's age, teenagers who have just an incredible grasp on
Thank you.
their reality, being able to tie things like hypervigilance to early childhood losses, and how so many folks, older folks, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, are just almost a sense of jealousy of like, wow, if only could have had that language earlier, which is why we are so excited to be able to offer, these mentorship services, especially to young folks.
Yep.
Ricky, you want to
Yeah.
add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Adam and Luna have been saying, and Luna, yeah, you give me a lot of hope for where the concept of adoptees in society will go. Because like growing up, really what I would see is a lot of insecure attachment as a result of being part of the foster care system. I was raised, my adoptive parents were foster parents as well, and so I would have a different number of siblings each year, right? So sometimes I would have eight, sometimes I would have six, sometimes I'd have 12. It all depend on the year. And so some of those siblings would be there for long periods of time. Some of them would be there for a few days, right? But as a child, I associated them with part of the family. And so when they were gone, and sometimes this would be like overnight, or this would be while I was at school, it like I would have trouble sleeping because I would be afraid that I'd wake up and one of my siblings would be gone, right? And so that's this ambiguous trauma that occurs where you don't know when the loss is going to happen or how the loss is going to
Mhm.
happen, but you've experienced it, so you know that it's possible. And so you just kind of are in this limbo, right, of fear. And growing up, that made me really reluctant to get into any type of relationships, whether social or romantic, because I was just afraid that all of a sudden they would just be gone, right? And that was the trauma that I was looking to avoid. And it took a lot of intentional behavior, a lot of um, research, a lot of therapy, a lot of medication, and all of those type of things to realize that that was what I was afraid of, right? And that is why I was avoiding commitment. I was avoiding any type of long-term relationship. Um, and once I realized that, then I was able to compartmentalize and put that where it belongs. Once I realized that I was just afraid of loss, right? It was a fear of loss. Um, and when I unfortunately when I brought these revelations to my adoptive parents, they were trying to avoid their own shame. So they would gaslight and be like, it was fine, or it's all in your head, or something like that. So I guess based on this current conversation, the only recommendation I would give is that once your adoptive child ex starts to communicate how they're feeling, believe them, right? So that they can start really developing and growing the emotional intelligence necessary to address those things. And that's why I think, Luna, you seem so emotionally intelligent because you've been allowed the space and time to just process this very ambiguous type of traumatization.
Ricky, how
Yeah,
was
I
it for
think
you to attend your first mentorship session?
The first mentorship session.
Yeah, how
Um,
was that process for you to like sign up, decide to do it, decide it's important?
yeah. So when you Um, as a mentor and mentee, several times over, I realize being a mentee is a lot harder, right? Because it requires you to be vulnerable to another person, and I avoided vulnerability. Like that was the most terrifying thing that I could possibly have. When I was a younger man, I created all these false realities just to avoid being Ricky, and that because that felt like vulnerability. And so agreeing to have a mentor and then engaging in mentorship and kind of following someone else's lead, even though I've done it many times over, every time I feel so vulnerable. And now I've associated that vulnerability with growth. But when I was younger, I associated that with harm, right? And so I avoided that vulnerability as much as I could.
So brave, and I'm so thankful for you sharing this in this space. Um, like you said at the beginning, one of your goals is just to be able to speak life into someone else that you don't even know who might be experiencing some of this. And I feel like what you just shared has great potential to do that.
It's so true. And if I could elaborate on that fear of losing people, that leads to the constant need to please everybody. I remember when I was younger, I would even call myself a shapeshifter in my journals. That's how I would sign it. That's how I felt. And I just wanted to be what everybody wanted me to be so they wouldn't leave. And through playing all those roles and trying to keep up with that, I ended up losing myself eventually. And that didn't help the anxieties. To be honest, there was a period in my life where I had crutched on alcohol to soothe the nerves that I was just constantly feeling. Am I good enough? Is this going to change? And, it was only when I had connected that to that fear of losing people that I was able to overcome that crutch, which took some time, but eventually it did happen. But I completely understand that aspect and just, wanting to be what everybody wanted you to be.
Yeah, we talk a lot about being a chameleon in adoptee lounges and in one-on-one spaces. And I think it's funny. We started tonight's event. Ricky and Adam both shared experiences of kind of acting that you did. There is a huge population of adoptees in the theater and acting world. There's also a there's a database specifically for adoptees in Hollywood because there's so many. And I feel like it's a maybe part of this, like really good at being someone else, being who the audience needs you to be. Like there's a unique skill set that we've developed that might lend way for that sort of behavior. And then the imagination, since we have to, I talk about in my book, go to the ghost kingdom so often and imagine life if we weren't adopted or if we had different parents here, that sort of thing. Um, that all makes sense where so many adoptees might land in a profession like that.
In an attempt to feel more comfortable in my own skin, I had actually decided to legally change my name in my late teens, maybe very early 20s. When looking back, I can see how my parents might have taken that as a slap in the face, but it honestly was what I needed to do to feel okay at that point. And that was only scratching the surface. So I kept Adam from my adoptive parents, which I love the name Adam. And then I changed my surnames back to my birth mother's surnames, which I had from my adoption papers, to just make me feel a bit more like my name, my fit me. And I remember that was a big thing for me. Even
Wow.
when I was auditioning to have that name on my headshot versus the other name.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
made me feel very awkward. The other one, I was like, okay, I could do this. I feel all right.
Yeah, similarly to that, my name when I was born was Luna Sunshine Lane, which is a very interesting name. And when I was talking to my biological aunt about it, she said that my biological mother was in like an a time of her life where she was very into like the solar system and like the moon and like all that good stuff. She was younger when she had me, so she was still in like her frontal lobe was not fully developed. So anyway, my parents kept the name Luna, but they changed my middle name to Marie because they weren't sure at the time. Luna was like a very uncommon name. Now it's kind of like it had a surge because the past couple of years it's been like on the top 10 names for like babies. So now it's more normal. But when I was born, this is not a normal name. And so they changed my middle name to Marie so that it was like a fallback name, which I find funny. But then my like adopted family have like they've always called me Luna Marie. So I like it because I kept my first name. Oh shoot.
Well, I want to open it up to your questions. So if you want to ask something in the chat, you can. If you want to raise your digital hand, you can, and come off mute and ask the questions of one or all or whomever. So while you're thinking on that, my final thought and question for all of you is just how has your connection to adoption changed based on being in this community and receiving mentorship?
I actually see being an adoptee as a real benefit.
Well,
And sorry.
it
Luna, you're frozen. Maybe
it didn't.
click out and then log back in.
Now I'm still.
Okay, keep going, Ricky.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have to say I see being an adoptee as a real benefit, because I've seen how other adoptees have turned their like trauma into really a triumph, right? And so that helped me also be able to accept my wins, as my triumphs as triumphs, and know that my journey as an adult and as a member of society was unique, but not by itself, right? I'm not the only one that was adopted. I'm not the only transracial adoptee. I'm not the only one that um, is it's like lives in this shade of gray culturally, right? I'm not the only third culture kid there, and that really is very empowering. And that encourages further growth, further development, just to know that this identity that you have is not something to be denied, even though it's a big part of yourself. And that like makes it a lot easier to carry, a lot easier to live with. Just knowing that it's not something that you have to fake or deny or ignore. I can just be a transracial adoptee named Ricky, and that is enough. And that is very empowering.
I think for me, I have come to not make being an adoptee all that I am, kind of like Ricky was saying, rather than, through talking with AMS, I'm able to look at it as something separate that happened to me. It definitely did happen to me, but it's not all encompassing. And that also means the abandonment issues and the people pleasing and all that is not all encompassing of me. And when you can separate yourself from the situation, you also separate yourself from those obstacles and you don't have to go through them anymore. For example, my people pleasing at one point in my life led me to staying around very toxic people. I was in an extremely abusive relationship for several years of my life, and I had ended up in the hospital finally with police around my bed asking me to press charges against my partner at the time. And I just would not do it. It was an absolute no for fear of losing this person. And in working through this, you realize that you do have to love yourself first. You do have to respect and show up for yourself first. And participating in the lounges in a routine way for me just keeps reinforcing that. Like when I wake up in the morning, it's that message to myself. And that's not how I used to live prior to it. I was secondary, and I was okay with being secondary as long as that meant that nobody would leave. And that's not the case anymore. So, in sharing these kind of stories and hearing other people's stories in AMS, it just builds upon that even more. We all kind of stem from the same ground, but at the same time, we're all different. So, and we all have different stories, all of which are valid. So, to hear all of these points, it only helps the adoptee more.
I love all of this conversation around primarily relationships and how could they not be vastly impacted? Of course, but if we don't have people around us making that link, then we're really likely to believe society in the generalization that adoption's just purely a good thing. And so to make those connections of addictions and toxic relationships and to put them to understand them ultimately will help us understand ourselves and then get to what you said, Adam, to love ourselves, which then allows us to love others and have healthy relationships. Ricky, there's a question for you that came in to me, and someone asked if coming into mentorship with AMS has shifted your role professionally.
Yeah, when I was 13 years old, this isn't a long story, I promise. When I was 13 years old, I wanted to be a marine biologist that studied cuttlefish in Peru, right? And then I realized that I was afraid of deep water because it wasn't just a, nature series. It was actually that I saw all those animals coming up and stuff like that. So I was like, well, social workers made a real big impact in my life, so I'll be a child welfare social worker. So I went to school to be a social worker, and I was like, I'm gonna be a child welfare protective services social worker. Um, but then I did supervised visitation a few times where you sit down with the child that's in foster care and their biological parent and you just observe this interaction and you just write notes about it. And I had such like extreme emotions that would stick with me for weeks. I any if the biological family did anything to upset the child, I was so upset at them. And my role was to observe and report. But I would just have to choke down all this rage. And then I realized that I can't work in protective services if I still have this unresolved trauma in me. And so that professionally was a crisis of faith, right? I was like, I have, since I was 13 years old, thought I was going to be this protective services social worker that would help children in child welfare. And then to realize that that wasn't professionally what I could do, I was a little lost. Many years later, um, I got the opportunity to work in early childhood intervention, so to work with families, but more on the prevention side. Um, and to today, now that I have this identity as an adoptee, it's helped me really resolve that rage, and get to the point where that rage can really like be fuel for my ambition and help. Because now I work directly, not directly, but like I work directly with the child welfare system on a lot of different projects and policies on the throughout the state of Wisconsin. And my perspective as a former foster child and as an adoptee has really enriched their practice and that experience because I've been able to be confident about that identity that is really, I mean, since June, it's only been a short time, but I've been really like a lot more um encouraged to seek out those connections because that rage I've realized is just a passion and that I don't and that something that can be a strong motivator for me and my voice is not heard a lot. Like the voice of former foster children, the voice of former of adoptees is not heard that often by professionals at the highest levels. And so me being able to be like, well, when you say those children, you're referring to me,
Yes.
right? So and that kind of advocacy has really impacted my colleagues quite a bit and the field that we work in as a whole. So um, being like professionally, all of like be like accepting my adoptee identity has really just fine-tuned. Like if I was an instrument, right? It tuned me um, to the point where I feel like I'm more impactful than I ever have been as a social worker.
Wow. Your trajectory is not too dissimilar from a lot of adoptees and former foster youth, people with lived experience in child welfare, um, in that many of us, myself included, go that route of becoming like a caseworker or working within uh, child welfare. Some people call it a family policing system. Um, but I think one reason that so many of us do that without excavating our own identities first is because it's a form of research. Like, let me get in and learn how does this work? And many academics who have to do PhD, who get their PhDs, have to do dissertations, and oftentimes it's me search. Research is me search and trying to figure out what happened to me. And now to see you at this point, Ricky, is pretty exciting. So empowering for all the others coming through. Um, Thank you, thank you, thank you. Great question. I see a couple of the questions, but I want to go to Mavka's hand first is raised. Feel free to come off of mute.
Thank you, and thanks, friends. Thanks for showing up tonight, all of you, and everyone who's spoken this evening. Ricky was in my first lounge, and I've been interacting with Adam a little, and this is my first experience with Luna. And everyone, I mean, I never show up here, and I'm like, wow, I really don't relate to that. But there's just so much richness that I'm pulling from this. But I want to say, Luna, my 17-year-old name is Molly, and 17-year-old me is so grateful for 17-year-old you being here tonight. I was not allowed to address my adoption. I was not allowed to interact with it. It was any way that I was solicited to do so was for them. It was never for me. And I'm so, I don't know that I have encountered a young adoptee um, in the years since I've kind of started to come out of the fog and come into adoptee spaces. And it's been a really, really intensely, like I've loved listening to you talk. And I'm curious as to, like, you're so well grounded. And it's interesting because I was also aware, like when I was doing screwy things at your age, I knew why I was doing them. And people would be like, you're doing it for attention. And I'd be like, yes, I'm doing it for attention. Pay attention to me, help me out. But I couldn't get that through to anybody. So I'm so glad that you have that. But I'm curious as to having come into this space and come into this at the age that you did and your involvement with it now. Is this something that how do you see your young adult self evolving and developing and participating kind of going forward in the adoptee community, and all of you for that matter? I love it. Anyway, thank you. That's my question.
Yeah, well, I've told my mom, I was like, if I were to ever be president, I'd run on improving the foster care system. And I I think it would reach more people than I think people think about because like I said, I've grown up going to private Christian school. And last year in my ethics class, we all had to pick like controversial topic, and then we had to say whether we were pro or like anti. And I picked a not controversial one because I didn't feel like stirring up anything. And I picked like performance enhancing drugs. But anyway, this one kid picked abortion. And so that conversation was super interesting because everyone had varying viewpoints. But I told him, I was like, if you're pro life like you're saying, then you have to improve the you have to improve the foster care system because where are you going to send all these kids that their parents are not wanting to like have them or can't, or like all the different reasons someone might get an abortion. And he was like, well, it doesn't really have anything to do with it. And I think that for me, I just see myself like wherever I go professionally or like to college or in my life, just like drawing more attention to adoption and maybe spaces it's not like very thought about in like the foster care system as well, which I admittedly did not spend too much time in, but I know a lot of people who have. And so I see myself just in the future, like wherever I go, just like making people aware of it. And then also, of course, staying involved in the Adoptee Mentoring Society in any way I can. I signed up for some volunteering later, so yeah.
Luna is incredible. It's obvious. Look, Luna, at the chat, by the way.
I saw some of it when I was
You saw some things. So I am not going to downplay that. I've known Luna for 5 years. Incredible. And I think a lot of us, for many of us adoptees, sometimes we have to act. Yeah, I mean, Luna said this earlier, like more independent than our age, or we have to become like the spokesperson for adoption, which I just don't think is always age appropriate. So one thing that you aren't seeing in this session is I think Luna is there have been sessions where I might push back on something or offer a different way of seeing the world. And Luna's ability to um, like accept that, be challenged, I think comes from the parents, having adoptive parents who are like just happy to give her this free space where they're not hovering, they're not in our sessions. She can work with this however she feels. It's like opposite of what you said, Mavka, where you're like, I wasn't allowed to talk about this. So many adoptees just need a very private space just for us to be able to play with these truths, ideas. Yes, that fits for me, and no, that doesn't fit for me. And that space I'm grateful Luna has because we're parents. I think that's
Mhm.
not true for a lot of adult adoptees, which is where these spaces can feel so strange at first. And by strange, I mean that there are adoptees who will come into the lounge and kind of be automatons. They will like regurgitate the story about themselves that they've heard their parents say for 20 years. And it takes a work to like deprogram that. Like, actually, I'm not asking you what your parents thought about adopting you and their infertility journey and all that stuff, but like and it takes a lot of work to undo that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You go. I went last time.
All right. Yeah, it's so like I put in the chat, like my adoptive parents always treated my adoptee identity as kind of a threat, right? Like someday I'm gonna go and find this family and we'll hold hands and ride off into the sunset, right? And then their family would be less than for it. And so they didn't want to talk about my adoptee identity. And so I took it upon myself, and I've kind of had to distance myself from that because to this day, they still don't really want to act like we are, like the majority of their kids are either former foster kids or adopted. And we don't talk about that identity to this day. And I just refuse to not do that. It's an important part of who we are, as individuals, right? In the United States, you just kind of see, for some reason, adoption is and foster care is seen as like this necessary burden, right? And so just imagine if you're the children that are like that burden, right? Like, and when you start to realize that that's just how society views you, everybody reacts to it differently. Some people start masking, some people avoid, some people get angry, right? And that's very different. It's like traumatization. It looks different for each and every single person, and it's expressed differently for every person. So when that rage come, if it turns into rage or anger, as an adoptive parent, it's important for you to embrace it. As an adopter, if you start to see your child recoiling from their personality, you have to embrace that, right? Because you're the adult, right? So you have to make the sacrifices. You have to make the tough choices, and part of that is risking your family changing, because this individual needs to have a positive affect in order to thrive in society. And part of that is coming to terms with that identity, and it can be really rough, right? I engaged in alcoholism. Adam went through his relationships and experiences as well, trying to live with this fear of loss. And it made it harder that my parents weren't willing to even support that identity and that journey, right? Um, and so for adopters, I would encourage you to kind of put your ego aside, right? And realize that you need to make the tough choices that your adoptive children can't make for themselves.
I think before going into business, I was a crisis interventionist, and it was really rewarding. But to be a successful crisis interventionist, you have to address the crisis. You can't sugarcoat it within the schools, especially with the children who are going through things that you would only fathom an adult going through. And the same thing applies to adoptees. I think it's wonderful for adoptees, especially Luna's age, to have these outlets, and hopefully it would mitigate some of the possible outcomes, which, like Rick was mentioning, and in my experience, have been to the darker outcome, the darker possibilities of things that can happen if they aren't addressed. And if you keep covering it up, it can lead to substance dependencies, toxic relationships, the things that I was mentioning before. So at least for me, it's important to address that side of things, that side of being an adoptee, those possibilities, because they can happen. And it's obviously something that I know I wouldn't want to see anybody that I cared about going through. And the way to mitigate that is to talk about it and to bring it up, even if it's not the most pleasant situation, because believe me, it's not many times, especially when you're going through it. So I'm going to try and address more of those things. I think it's extremely important.
Something I wanted to add that is important to me and maybe just unique to me, but I noticed in the comments, there was conversation about therapy and like how I think someone's 13-year-old daughter is in therapy. I was in therapy when I was 13 and I hated it because and it was a transracial like group in foster care, like adopted man, and I didn't hate him. That's not what I didn't like about it. It was that like somebody was like listening to my problems because they were like paid to, and that like I ran out of things to say to this random stranger. Just every week, it's like, oh, hi again. Like we're talking about like these problems I guess I have because my parents are sending me here, and it gave me this identity that I had problems, so I had to go to therapy. And maybe it's a stigma towards therapy that I've had, but I think it's hard when you're younger and like to do something like therapy because when people go to therapy, typically there's some sort of problem. And the difference between that and an adoptee lounge for me was that I wasn't going to this place because I had a problem or because like I needed to be like fixed in a way. It was because I was wanting to, like I could talk about the same things with people that understood it, but they were there to interact and have like a friendship or like a just like a kinship. And I also enjoyed that I saw these people maybe some people I only saw once in my whole life, but I didn't have to like build a relationship and like worry about them leaving because it was like a connection that's like more like above being um like being in like relationship with people. I don't It's the same thing when people have like a religion to me where like everyone like kind of has something that's like above them. That's what like being in a space that's adopted to me feels similar because I am a Christian. Being in like my youth group, it's like we have this like connection that's above just like our individual selves.
Yeah, the collective. It's so incredible how you put that. I love it. One of the big reasons I founded this org was just that. I felt like if ever folks wanted to talk about adoption, it became pathologized really quickly. Like go to therapy and talk about it. Whereas there oftentimes was not a diagnosis or anything to fix, but rather to talk through this very unique life experience. Um, this is so beautiful. I want to wrap us up. Um, and the three panelists, if you have final words, be thinking about that as I just share a little bit about AMS to close us. I know one mom asked in the chat about how to help her child become part of AMS, and we can't force people to do anything. And for adoptees, I think it is really important that our choices matter, that adoptees can say, I don't want to do that, and we believe them, listen to them. And if we can reduce the amount of adoptees who grow up saying, I never knew there was adoptee spaces, then we're good. So just making sure that adoptees know it's available and then they get to choose. I also saw some questions about like the structure of the lounge versus one-on-one, and those are great questions. I think Amanda responded. But also, if there's anybody here who wants to become more involved, to become a mentor is quite a process because my team and I take it really seriously to be in someone's life in this way. And so you want to get involved early. It's not just I want to become a mentor, I'm going to apply, and then you're in. The process really involves going to a lot of lounges and doing one-on-ones, seeing how it works, what's discussed. Like all of that is really important for us to mitigate harm in the future, that our mentors are not um, inadvertently just kind of working on themselves through a mentee or hurting them. Like we will not be doing that. So please do, if you're an adoptee and you're interested in being in the space, um, connect with us early. Okay, that's my soapbox, but Ricky, Adam, Luna, can't thank you enough. Is there anything that you don't feel like, anything that you haven't said that you want to say before we close?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's um being a parent in general is very difficult, right? It's like you take on like somebody else's past, present, and future, right? So not only do you have to consider yourself, you have to consider someone else, sometimes more than you consider yourself. But when it comes to identity, that's something that is grown over time, and there's no like book that can guide you through that. You just have to weather the storm and stay prepared, right? So a lot of times I see adopters ask about like, what can I do? What if I send them here? What if I do this? Honestly, the greatest thing that I needed was that secure attachment, right? And my adoptive family provided that for me as long as they could, right? And so just being consistent, predictable, and reliable, my wife will tell you, I say this all the time, um, that makes the difference. It's not what classes you sent me or what therapist you provided me or what camp you sent me to. It was the consistency, the predictability, and the reliability that um, enabled me to have that positive affect and to have that secure attachment to be able to go out into the world and make the most of my life. So it's not, again, it's not something a commodity that you provide or like a video you watch or a book you read. It's really you just being consistent, predictable, and reliable and providing CPR to the heart of that individual, your child.
Oh, trademark this. Oh, Ricky.
Um,
Sticker. Okay.
I just want to add something that was told to me, like, and examples in school growing up was like people, like teachers would be like, well, when something's for sure, like, a parent will never like leave their child. It was always said as like an example of like something that would just like never happen in anyone's wildest dreams. And I think that my parents, like my adopted parents, have like showed me that that is like true in the way that like I know they'll never leave me, and maybe like biological mothers and biological fathers, they're not like good parents just because they have that title. And um I think that, like Ricky was saying, just having that like this like dependence, being able to have dependence on someone is really important to like kids and teenagers and even like adults. Just humans are made to be codependent, and when you're independent, life is a lot sadder. So I would work, like, it's less about like what giving stuff, but like really work to build like interdependence within like a family and within um relationships with other people.
I think it's vital to realize, as for the non-adoptee and the adoptee, that the non-adoptee is not gonna understand fully. They're not fully gonna get it. They're not adopted. That's okay. But what the adoptee is looking for is really that receptiveness, not to say, okay, they completely understand where I'm coming from, but to be open into seeing this other side, which is our side, which many of us do feel has been overshadowed and not spoken on enough. So it's that receptiveness that is the goal, and to let go of the stress of wanting people to fully understand, because they may never unless they are an adoptee.
True. Let's end it there. So grateful. This is so enriching. Definitely has the power to change the way people parent their adoptees and to perhaps allow adoptees to opt into these spaces without fear that, we are all angry adoptees, or it's just a place to bash parents, or some of the stereotypes and things that people feel. I think all of you have provided a lot um, to deepen it, to give this more nuance. So thank you. I'm proud of all of you. I'm so grateful for everybody who showed up and were so respectful and courteous of these three who were vulnerable. So thank you. Please share about AMS and our work with whomever you know, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.